The Vatican press room was colder than usual that morning, not in temperature, but in tone. Something unspoken hung in the air, like incense clinging to ancient stone. This was not a routine briefing. It was an ambush, and everyone sensed it. Cameras lined the back wall. Microphones blinked. Behind them, journalists waited, not for answers, but for headlines. One stood out among them, not because of her credentials, but because of her intent. Julia Casari, 34. Fierce. Articulate. A name that stirred admiration in some and discomfort in others. Her fame had been built not on fairness, but on confrontation. She didn't interview. She dismantled. She didn't greet the Pope. She didn't smile. Her first words were loaded and sharp, honed to cut. Your Holiness, with all due respect, how long will the Church continue clinging to the lie of priestly celibacy? The world has moved on. Families are sacred too. Are you willing to admit that this rule is not only outdated, but dangerous? A murmur flickered across the room like wind across a flame. Some lowered their eyes. Others leaned in. Cardinals flanking the Pope exchanged wary glances. But Pope Leo XIV did not move. He did not lift a hand, nor blink away the weight of her accusation. He simply listened. There was something disarming in his stillness. It wasn't passivity. It was precision. He let her speak, let the echo of her words settle into the marble walls of that holy place. And when he finally responded, it wasn't with a defense. It wasn't even with explanation. He spoke one sentence, nothing more, but the moment it left his mouth, it stopped the world. You speak of celibacy as if it were a curse, he said, but I have buried men who wore it like a crown. The silence that followed did not belong to the press. It belonged to history. It belonged to every priest who had poured out his life in quiet service. It belonged to every young man discerning a calling in a world that mocked it. It belonged to something older, deeper, holier. Even Julia felt it, though she would never admit it. Something in her throat tightened. Not fear, not awe, something harder to name. The room did not applaud. It didn't need to, because something had just shifted, not in politics, not in policy, but in power. And the ones who weren't listening closely, they missed the sound of a turning age. If that silence left a mark on your soul, if something in you stirred when he spoke, then you know what to do. Subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if you won't, then walk into the comments and confess what's keeping you outside. He was never supposed to be Pope. That's what the insiders said when the white smoke rose. A man from the mountains? A priest who walked with llamas instead of entourages? A cardinal who refused chauffeur service, who still carried the leather-bound missal his mother gave him before seminary. But that was exactly why he was chosen. Leo XIV, born Alejandro Vicente de la Cruz, had heard the call of God not in the grand cathedrals of Europe, but in the wind-scoured hills of the Andes. He had said his first Mass beneath a leaky tin roof, with barefoot children kneeling on dirt floors. He baptized the dying with river water. He anointed the sick by candlelight during blackouts. For years, his only pulpit had been the tailgate of a broken-down truck. And yet, his mind was no less sharp than the professors in Rome. He had studied, taught, debated, but he never let intellect insulate him from suffering. That was his scandal. That was his threat. To the poor, he was beloved. To the powerful, he was inconvenient. Julia Casari had studied him for months before the press conference. She had watched his speeches, dissected his writings, even visited his birthplace. And she still couldn't pin him down. Traditionalist or revolutionary, conservative or radical. He seemed to belong to both camps and neither. His words carried scripture, but his tone disarmed ideology. That made him dangerous. Julia was not unfamiliar with powerful men. She had built her career tearing them apart. Her interviews had become viral confessionals. Politicians, bishops, CEOs, all left raw and exposed by her relentless lens. She knew how to corner, to needle, to make even seasoned leaders unravel in front of millions. But this was different. The setting itself was unfamiliar territory, the apostolic palace, a place of echoes and eyes, walls painted with the history of the church. A press room that had never hosted a conversation like this. public and censored, streamed in real time to over 130 countries. Outside, crowds pressed against barricades. Inside, a handful of voices prepare to ask questions not heard aloud in centuries. Why must priests be celibate? Why not women at the altar? Why must sacrifice be institutionalized? The old guard had warned against this. It will unravel tradition, they whispered. It will invite wolves into the courtyard. But Leo XIV had simply replied, Christ didn't run from hard questions. Neither will I. And so, there he sat, still, open, unguarded, while Julia tightened her grip on the microphone, fully prepared to make this her finest hour. What she didn't expect was that he had come prepared too. Not with notes, not with a team of handlers, but with something she didn't know how to fight. Conviction without cruelty. Wisdom without pride. Truth without aggression. He did not come to win. He came to witness. And that changed everything. Before we go any deeper, ask yourself this. Would you have the courage to stand for truth when the world's watching? To sit where he sat, knowing the storm was coming? If yes, subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if no, then step into the comments and tell the world why silence feels safer than conviction. The cameras had long begun rolling, but no one in the room was truly watching the screens. Their eyes were fixed on the living confrontation, two worlds seated across from one another, divided by centuries, but now joined in a single moment. Julia adjusted her notes, though she didn't need to. Her questions were memorized, rehearsed, and sharpened with deliberate care. She didn't plan to attack. Not yet. First, she would lead him in. Let him feel comfortable. Let the audience believe this was just a conversation. She spoke without raising her voice. Your Holiness, she began, with declining vocations across the globe and a wave of scandals still echoing through the church. Is mandatory celibacy still viable? Her tone was respectful, but the room heard the blade beneath it. She hadn't asked if celibacy was good or beautiful or sacred. She asked if it was viable, like an outdated law or a failing political platform. Pope Leo didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang, not to stall, but to dignify it. He wasn't just responding to Julia. He was responding to everyone who had ever whispered that same doubt and wondered if the church had the courage to answer it. Finally, he said quietly, viable. He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the word in his hands. It's been a lifeline for centuries, he said. But viability is not the only measure of virtue. The room stiffened. It wasn't the answer she expected. It wasn't defensive, nor was it evasive. It was a statement spoken from the deep, a place of memory, of conviction. Julia pressed on, eyes narrowing just slightly. Don't you think forced celibacy leads to hidden damage? Repression, scandal, brokenness. It was a bolder move, and she knew it. The accusation was no longer veiled. She had named it, scandal, and dared him to step away from the edge. But Leo didn't flinch. He looked at her the way a father looks at a wounded child, grieved but not ashamed. Celibacy, he said, is not forced. It's offered. He leaned forward, not with aggression, but with intimacy, like Christ offered himself. Not because he had to, but because love demands everything or nothing. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The quiet weight of his words fell heavier than any outrage could. Julia's face remained composed, but something shifted, a small tightening around the eyes. A barely perceptible pause before she looked down at her notes again. She had come expecting resistance. She had prepared for rigidity. She had not prepared for tenderness. What she faced now was a man who did not defend doctrine like a wall, but who lived it like a vow. She glanced back up and tried to reset the tone. But the world is changing, she offered. Don't you think the church should too? Leo smiled faintly, not in amusement, but in compassion. The church is always changing, he said, but she must never stop asking what she's changing into. A few in the room stirred. Even behind the cameras, a technician leaned slightly forward, forgetting his job. Because this was not a political exchange. It was something older, something harder to fake. It was two visions of the world colliding, and only one had weathered centuries without collapsing. Do you see what she's doing? Do you see what's at stake? If you're nodding silently behind your screen, if you feel the tremor beneath her questions, hit subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if you don't, then step into the comments and tell us why silence suits you better. She had tested his composure, and he hadn't blinked. She had pulled a thread she thought might unravel him. Vocation statistics, psychological tropes, the thundercloud of scandal. And yet Pope Leo XIV remained still. Not indifferent, not defensive. Still, as if anchored somewhere she couldn't see. But Julia Casari hadn't come to lose quietly. She shifted in her seat now, not out of discomfort but preparation. Her voice lowered in pitch, sharpened in rhythm. The veneer of journalistic courtesy began to peel away, revealing something far more deliberate beneath. But is celibacy, she asked, truly a spiritual calling, or just an ancient mechanism of control? She didn't pause for effect. She didn't need to. The word hung there, control, with the weight of every abuse report, every whispered name, every headline the church had endured over the past 50 years. And she knew it. She leaned in now. Let's be honest, she said. The doctrine of celibacy has preserved power structures, allowed for secrets, created hierarchies that demand submission but avoid accountability. Isn't it time we admit that the tradition, whatever its origins, has too often become a shield for corruption? Somewhere in the back of the room, a pen slipped from someone's hand. No one moved to retrieve it. Pope Leo didn't interrupt. He didn't shift, but the silence around him did. When he spoke, it was not a rebuttal. It was remembrance. He said, I once knew a priest named Father Emmanuel. He served in Sudan, in a village most people couldn't find on a map. He had nothing, no car, no electricity, no roof that didn't leak. But he had children, orphans who had seen war, who had buried their mothers, who screamed in their sleep. He stayed with them. He fed them, taught them, protected them. Leo paused, not for drama, but for grief. The memory was not theoretical. It lived in him. One day militants came, and he stood between their rifles and the children's bodies. They shot him. He bled out beside a garden he planted with their names. The room was frozen. That man chose celibacy not to isolate, Leo said quietly, but to serve with his whole heart. He belonged to no one, so he could belong to them. Julia let the weight of the story pass. Then, with almost surgical precision, she spoke again. But would he have served less if he had a wife? A family of his own? This was the question beneath all others, not about celibacy, but about fullness. Could a life without romantic love still be whole? Pope Leo didn't dismiss it. He nodded slowly. Perhaps not, he said, but he would have served differently. He looked directly at her now, not confrontationally, but as if inviting her into a truth too fragile for cynicism. That distinction matters, he continued. Marriage is beautiful. So is celibacy. But they are not interchangeable. They form different kinds of hearts. One is rooted in covenant, the other in surrender. She opened her mouth to speak, but he wasn't done. The church has always distinguished between sacred disciplines and divine doctrine. Celibacy is the former. It can change, but that doesn't make it disposable. It makes it deliberate. And in that moment, even those who had rolled their eyes when the press conference began were now listening. He had not defended a rule. He had illuminated a mystery. He had not clung to tradition. He had revealed its architecture. Julia sat still, her notepad untouched now. She had come with all the right questions, but she hadn't expected him to carry all the right sorrows. If you've ever believed sacrifice still means something, if you've ever felt the quiet beauty of a hidden life, one lived without applause or agenda, then subscribe to Holy Shadows. And if not, leave your reason in the comments. We read everyone, and sometimes we pray over them. It was the kind of silence that didn't follow an answer, but a revelation. The kind that steals breath and thought in the same moment. But Julia had seen silence before, and misread it too often to be fooled by it now. She sees the pause not as reverence, but opportunity. So you're saying celibacy might end? She asked, more pointed now, voice rising just enough to register in every microphone. Are you bowing to pressure? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in disbelief. She was no longer pretending to seek clarity. She was naming what others had feared behind closed doors. If celibacy could change, then what else could? The weight of centuries now hung like a cracked bell, trembling between the past and whatever came next. For the first time, Pope Leo did not answer immediately, not because he hesitated, but because truth, when sacred, must not be rushed. He looked at her, not with indignation nor fatigue, but with the grave patience of a man who had walked long roads alone and still believed they mattered. "I am bowing," he said slowly, "to the cross, not the crowd." His words did not echo. They settled. They did not shake the room. They stilled it. He continued, his voice low but steady, unshaken by the storm now gathering in the eyes of journalists who sensed history bending before them. For centuries, celibacy has been a sign of radical love, a sign that a man could surrender even his deepest human longing to belong entirely to Christ and his people. But signs can change. The love does not. Somewhere near the back, a flashbulb popped. No one turned toward it. No one moved. Even the Vatican staff, those long practiced in stoic calm, stood still now, as if time itself had slowed to make room for what was coming next. Then Leo said the words that would travel farther than any edict, farther than any doctrine ever signed in ink. "We are beginning," he said, "a path of discernment." And then, clearly, without evasion, without retreat, married priests already exist in the Church, in the Eastern rites, in special cases. But soon, they may be allowed more freely. There was no thunderclap, no dramatic shift in lighting. But the room changed all the same. A few mouths parted, not to speak, but to absorb. One aide's pen hovered mid-air, never landing. A bishop near the doorway closed his eyes. A young seminarian behind the cameras dropped his clipboard and didn't bother to pick it up. Julia swallowed, not because she was caught, but because, for the first time, she hadn't predicted this. She had come prepared to confront a fortress of dogma. But she hadn't prepared for what it would mean if the fortress opened its gates, not in fear, but in faith. She wasn't alone in her disbelief. Across the globe, screens were lighting up in seminaries, newsrooms, rectories, and dinner tables. Some would cheer, others would tremble, a few would rage, but no one would ignore what had just been said. Because Leo hadn't dismantled celibacy. He had unsealed it, lifted it out of glass, held it to the light. And in doing so, he had asked a far more dangerous question than the one Julia posed. He had asked, what matters more, what we protect or what we offer? If that moment stunned you, if it cracked your expectations wide open and made you question whether you've misunderstood the heart of sacrifice, this is your call. Subscribe to Holy Shadows. Or comment now why you'd rather scroll away than face what's coming. Because the ground is shifting, and silence will not save you from the weight of truth. Julia steadied herself, blinking once, as if trying to recalibrate the moment. What Pope Leo had just said didn't register as retreat. It registered as strategy, and not the kind she could outmaneuver with numbers or headlines. Still, she pressed forward. "So, this is damage control?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but the charge beneath it was unmistakable. A PR move after decades of scandal? You're softening rules to stop the bleeding. It was a provocation, designed not merely to question his intent, but to collapse his credibility. If he admitted it, the world would see a church flinching. If he denied it too forcefully, he'd appear defensive, guilty even. But Leo did neither. His reply came with such unshakable gentleness it made the challenge feel almost small in comparison. "No," he said, with eyes that did not flinch, "this is shepherding souls, not shifting ideologies." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't tighten his jaw. He simply looked at her, one soul speaking to another, not across enemy lines, but across a chasm of understanding. And then, with clarity that reoriented the entire room, he said, "Celibacy is not dogma. It is discipline. Sacred, yes. Historical, yes. But not immutable." He wasn't lowering the bar. He was elevating the conversation. "You confuse mystery with manipulation," he said. You think that because the world no longer understands a thing, it must be hiding something. But not every tradition is a prison, and not every change is a betrayal. Now the murmurs began. It wasn't outrage. It was realization. Some turned to each other. Others simply stared forward, stunned that a centuries-old institution could speak with such calm honesty, without retreat, but also without fear. And then Leo did what no one expected. He turned the lens back on Julia, but not with accusation, with invitation. "Why," he asked softly, "does the idea of a free, self-giving priest disturb you so much?" The question wasn't rhetorical, and it wasn't cruel. It was honest, so piercing in its compassion that it felt like it reached past her arguments and touched something beneath them. She blinked again, slower this time. For a moment, just a moment, she didn't answer. Because for the first time in the interview, she wasn't sure who was holding the upper hand, or whether the concept of power still applied at all. The air shifted. Even the lights seemed to dim, not physically, but in the way a theater dims when the actor delivers the line the play has been building toward all along. He had not defended the church. He had not denied its failures. He had not protected power. He had spoken of souls. And souls, unlike systems, cannot be silenced by clever phrasing or discredited by scandal. They remain. And so did the question, why does the idea of a free, self-giving priest disturb you so much? If you're still watching, still listening, still breathing through that question, then something in you knows this wasn't just a media moment. It was a mirror. He just turned the entire debate inside out, with grace, not aggression, with clarity, not spin. If you can still sit idle, ask yourself, why? Subscribe to Holy Shadows. Or enter the comments and explain your silence. Because silence here isn't neutral. It's a response. Pope Leo did not move for a long moment. The silence in the press room was not discomfort. It was reverence. A silence rarely given to authority anymore, and even more rarely earned. And then he spoke again. Not to Julia. Not to the journalists. Not to the Vatican aides lining the walls. He looked straight into the camera. Straight into you. His voice, stripped of every performance, carried nothing but truth. This isn't about one rule, he said. It's about the soul of the priesthood. He let that hang, not as rhetoric, but as reckoning, because that was the question beneath all the others. Not just whether a priest should marry, not just whether tradition should bend, but what kind of men would stand at the altar and what kind of church would they lead? A celibate priest, a married priest. He let the words unfold with purpose. Both must be servants, not rulers. Fathers, not functionaries. No one blinked. He wasn't redefining the priesthood. He was recovering it, pulling it out from behind centuries of confusion, corruption, clericalism, scraping it back down to its essence. The man who stands between heaven and earth not to dominate, but to lay himself down. He quoted Paul, not with theatrical cadence, but as if speaking of a friend. Let everything be done for the building up. The words struck differently now. They were not theological. They were architectural. The task of a church not collapsing under its own weight, but rediscovering what its foundation had always been. And then Pope Leo delivered his final line, not as decree, not as doctrine, but as diagnosis and plea. The church must remain holy and human, or it will become neither. That was not a warning. That was a vow. Holy, set apart. Human, fully present. Not choosing between heaven and earth, but living as the bridge. And then he fell silent again. Not because he was finished speaking, but because there was nothing more to say. Only something to choose. If that vision of holiness moves you, if you want a church that weeps for its wounds and still dares to rebuild, subscribe to Holy Shadows. If not, tell us honestly below why you won't. But don't stay lukewarm. Not now. Not when the church is at the edge of something real. What would you have said if you were in that room with Pope Leo XIV? Would you have risen to speak your heart? To press him on doctrine, on discipline, on the unyielding traditions that bind the church? Or would you have listened, truly listened, to the burden behind his words, the years of sacrifice and sorrow that shaped his vision? This moment was more than an interview. It was a crucible where faith, doubt, and hope were weighed, and none emerged unchanged. It was an invitation to wrestle with questions that have no easy answers, but demand our deepest honesty. Now the stage is yours. What would you say if you stood there, beneath the gaze of centuries and the eyes of millions? Would you defend the old ways with passion? Would you call for radical change with fire? Or would you seek to understand the tension between tradition and transformation, the fragile line where sacred mystery dwells? We ask you to bring your voice into this conversation, not to shout, but to speak with humility, to lay down judgments and pick up empathy, to remember that behind every rule, every discipline, every crisis, there are human souls, frail, searching, yearning for grace. This is not a call for division. It is a call for courage, for truth, for the willingness to sit with discomfort and still believe in something greater than ourselves. So join us in the comments below. Share your reflections. Ask your questions. Reveal your struggles. Because Holy Shadows is more than channel. It is a community bound by the pursuit of light in the darkest places. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. And may our hearts never grow too proud to be changed. If you feel the stirrings of conviction, the pull of something beyond mere opinion, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. And if you hesitate, if you resist, tell us why. Because silence, too, speaks. And in the shadows, even silence longs for light.